Hello and welcome to this short video about left realist solutions to crime, evaluation points. So in an essay on left realist solutions to crime, you'd want to talk about the left realist views, concepts of relative deprivation, marginalisation, subcultures as the causes of crime. You'd want to talk about trying to reduce relative deprivation, reduce marginalisation. Some of the measures that are recommended is community crime prevention. So the left realists advocate local democratic consensual policing. In other words, the police act based on negotiation and discussion with the community about what they're concerned about. So several concerns or criticisms that you can make. Firstly, the community may focus on issues that are less important or not beneficial. This would be supported by thinkers like functionalists, who would argue that the criminal justice system and the police and courts play a functional role. That you can apply the idea of risk assessment to target crime in a scientific way, rather than basing it on subjective opinion. You can be more objective. So they'd say that the left realist approach may be too subjective. The Marxists would argue that this approach is not radical enough. Ultimately, the left realists use a traditional definition of crime. The Marxists might support a more radical definition of crime that extends to social harms. They'd also argue that the community crime prevention is likely to underplay problems caused by corporate and white-collar crime, because it's likely to overplay street crime. Another solution to crime from left realists that we can discuss is restorative justice. The idea of enabling offenders to try to repair some of the harm caused by crime, often meet with the victim, discuss the impact of crime. Victim-offender mediation can enable the victim to achieve resolution and deal with psychological fears and feelings, and it can enable the offender to understand the harm they've caused, and this can involve reintegrative shaming, so that they can be rehabilitated because they regret their behaviour, rather than further marginalised because they feel ashamed of what they are, which is the traditional the effect of the traditional system in prisons. So restorative justice can help people feel guilt in a way which is likely to lead to less reoffending, whereas prison tends to lead to reoffending because people are further hardened criminals or damaged by the experience. Restorative justice is said to lead to a 27% drop in reoffending. The reoffending rate is normally 50%. So several criticisms we can make of this. We could argue that this is too sympathetic to offenders, and it underplays or ignores the rational choice made by individuals to commit crime. And we therefore need to use punishment rather than restorative justice as a deterrent on a wider scale. For example, public punishment, so that people understand that crime does not pay. The right realists like Wilson would argue prison works. We need to use retributive justice, where we have just deserts or fair consequences for behaviour, rather than sympathy, rather than reintegrating people. So overall, the restorative justice approach could be seen as too soft from a new right approach, which would emphasise keeping traditional punishments the same. Lastly, we've got economic reforms and social reforms. So let's look at economic reforms, which might involve improving living standards. Left realists might say improve the living standards of the poor, reduce unemployment. Several criticisms could be made of that. Functionalists argue this is not meritocratic. Thinkers like Parsons argue we live in a meritocracy where status is based on ability and effort. So rather than supporting individuals, we need to enable individuals to have equal opportunities, which they would argue is generally provided in the new modern society. Right realists would support this and say that we need a small state, not a nanny state, which would be which would be the consequence of economic reforms. So we need to reduce welfare to provide more economic efficiency and profits, which can trickle down to the poor and benefit them in the long term, rather than spending money on welfare, which creates dependency and an underclass, according to Murray. So what economic reforms might be seen as problematic by those thinkers, because it doesn't encourage self-reliance of individuals. It encourages a sense of entitlement and rights rather than responsibilities. Social reforms like leisure facilities are recommended by left realists. We could discuss how, again, these kinds of approaches tend to give people a sense of entitlement rather than encouraging people to develop their own lifestyle and status based on a meritocratic system. This would be supported by thinkers like Saunders, who might argue that we don't need social reforms. We need to perhaps go back to a more rigid system where people knew where they stood, because society is fair but unequal, and therefore we don't need to reduce inequality because society is meritocratic. I hope this helps. Obviously, for a full essay, probably want to criticise with more than just right realists. So let's just have a look at what we could say. We've mentioned Marxists as well, though. The feminists would argue that left realist solutions to crime focus too much on street crime because of the focus on the community in terms of their concerns. There is the worry that people won't be open about issues like private sphere of the family and domestic violence. So they might argue that we need to go further in supporting women to be able to discuss issues of abuse in the home, which are often hidden in the community. Obviously, for restorative justice to work, it might involve victim-offender mediation. Feminists might be concerned that rapists or those who've committed sexual abuse offences should be named and shamed in some cases, rather than reintegrated into society. There might be better to make an example of such people. So it might say the left realist approach is perhaps too sympathetic in some cases. It depends on the type of feminist, but some radical feminists may support that, like Brown Miller. In terms of economic reforms, improving the living standards of the poor might be supported by feminists as a good idea. They might emphasise how this particularly applies to women who are part of the poverty group. There is the issue of the feminisation of poverty. They might argue that left realists might be underplaying this because of their focus on the economy and underplaying the private sphere of the family as linked to the economy. The postmodernists have studied the idea of preemptive deterrence, preemptive deterrence, trying to prevent crime before it happens, is something supported by left realists. Might be like changing features in the environment, such as target hardening, better locks on doors, plastic pint glasses in pubs. The left realists might support that. The postmodernists argue that increasingly actuarial justice, situational crime prevention, which is essentially what preemptive deterrence is like, where we're basically assessing risk, which is what an actuary does. Situational crime prevention, we're just changing or trying to analyse the situations in which crime commonly takes place. For example, in a pub where there's a glass. The postmodernists might argue this is reducing the focus on society and increasingly taking a small-scale, piecemeal approach to social change. And they might argue that we need to take a more radical view, especially the postmodernists who are influenced by Marxism, such as Jameson. I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions, please email Daniel_Butcher at hotmail.co.uk.